We begin 2025 with big questions. Crime is down, but justice is still elusive. Elections are coming, but governance goes beyond the ballot box. What should Jamaica prioritize this year? I am Kwame Thomas, and this is The Conversation. Tonight, I sit down with Professor Rosalea Hamilton to cut through the noise and get to the real issues. Welcome to The Conversation. Welcome to The Conversation, Prof. Hamilton. How are you?
I'm doing very well.
And Happy New Year.
Same to you.
I hope that it started off with a bang.
Yes, it did.
Awesome. If we were to strip away all the political spin, what's that one issue in 2025 that as a country we cannot afford to ignore?
Changing our constitution in a comprehensive way to deliver the kinds of economic and social outcomes that we want.
When you say changing the conversation or the constitution in a comprehensive way, how would that look though?
All right, so, we have inherited a constitutional arrangement that's not working for us. Let's just put it that way. And I say that because a lot of the governance issues that you see are rooted there. And I would say by extension, a lot of the economic issues have roots there. And I say it because when we look at the legal framework that we have, it concentrates powers one place, in the cabinet and in the prime minister, and it pretty much disempowers many of us. People in the communities across Jamaica have no voice. And although we've put local government arrangements in place, we have local government in the Constitution, and we have legislation that seeks to empower and give voice to local communities. Not only are local communities not defined anywhere, so we're not clear what exactly that is. We know it intuitively, but these communities have no power to make the kinds of decisions that ultimately can impact their lives. There's no mechanisms in place, and the mechanisms that do exist at the local government level are not working. And they're not working for all kinds of reasons. We don't have time in this program, but I suggest that, and I have spoken to people who have tried those mechanisms. Some, in fact, say they work. Others say they don't. And the question is, are those mechanisms adequate to deliver the kinds of outcomes that we want? And fundamentally, the outcomes that Jamaicans want is to lift their standard of living.
Well, I'm happy that you touched on economics because the data is showing that the economy has grown. It has grown, it is growing, at least on paper. Are you now arguing that it is not growing for everyone, or this is just growing on paper, full stop?
Well, again, the metrics that we use to assess the well-being of our economy, these macroeconomic indicators, are one set of indicators that tend to capture how well we're managing the resources of our country, but they typically do not capture the kinds of economic well-being of our citizens. So a piece of macroeconomic data that we've typically ignored in measuring on an annual basis how well we're doing is the GDP per capita. And when we look at that, if we look closely, we'll see that our current GDP per capita, which is about $5,300 a year on average, the real GDP per capita, we've only surpassed that 4 times in our 62 years of independence. And so we've pretty much stagnated with respect to a standard of living. I mean, it's gone up and down, but we've only done better than we've done in 2023 4 times in the past. That's not good enough. And importantly, our Vision 2030 is to achieve first world standards. But if we look at the GDP per capita, say in the OECD countries, we're looking at closer to $40,000 per annum. We have a huge gap, a huge way to go. If we look at our Caribbean and Latin American countries, then you're talking about $9,000. And if we were to look at just small island states, because, you know, we could say, all right, we're small, we shouldn't compare ourselves to these big countries. And this is World Bank data. We'll tell you that the small states across, you know, Pacific and so on,
yes,
it's 12,000. So we are way below where we want to be, because I think most Jamaicans would agree with me, they want to lift their standard of living.
So, well, we talk about the standard of living, and we know that we can't talk about it in isolation, because how we might see our standards would be different from how everyone else sees us. Is it right for us to say that based on the World Bank data, could it be that we just simply need to create our own rubric and have our own measurements or metrics so that we can then go about it a particular way? I'm not sure.
Well, we do live in an international, a global, and all the metrics that you use to suggest that we're doing well are global metrics. So the GDP per capita is a global metric. But I think your point, though, gets to how do we define a satisfactory standard of living that is acceptable to all of us? And that answer has to lie in all of us collectively. And I think it has to include the freedom to be able to make decisions that impact our lives. And I think that the framework that we have in terms of our Constitution, where we see this concentration of power in one place, we don't see enough of the decentralization. If you look, I hear it all the time on televisions, I hear the mayors talking about more resources that they need and more capacity to create their own resources. But the same is true for communities. When you listen to the communities, they're saying, listen, there's more that they can do, but they don't have the power to do it.
So in light of the economics and the broader topic that we started off with in terms of the whole constitutional reform, can I argue then that we're not having the right national conversation? Is it a case whereby we're literally just distracted by political theater or whatever it is?
Absolutely, I agree with you. And one important point is that our role in both the political, economic, governance and constitutional arrangements, for most Jamaicans, we're just hands off. You know, we just not now going for we. We just kind of haul ourselves out of these conversations, and basically, it no matter, right? That's the typical kind of approach. And of course, you know, when it comes to the politics, you know, politics dirty, you don't want to get involved, it no matter, the two of them is the same thing. I mean, those are the conversations you hear. And I say to Jamaicans, listen, yes, we have some issues, yeah? We have a lot of issues. But we have a lot of good things going for us, right?
Yeah, but that's not one of them.
Right.
Some persons will say that's not one of them.
Right. But if we want to build a democracy, and this discussion about a democracy is so important in the current global context, because there's been so much dissatisfaction with the expression of democracy in so many countries, including the biggest democracy in our backyard, right? The US. There's so much conversation and dissatisfaction as to what it has yielded. And just one clue is the disparities of income that we've seen over the past many years. Unprecedented. And so these kinds of outcomes, people blame on democracy and say, well, you know, let's go to something else. And all of a sudden, dictatorship is looking very attractive. I've heard Jamaicans talk about this. You know, that, you know, we want a dictator or what have you, as if that is going to solve the fundamental problems we have.
Could it be then that some persons might just have the impression that, listen, the cup is full and by any means necessary, because we hear now that the crime stats are showing crime is down. Crime is down roughly about 6%. In comparison to 2014 or 15 is about 19%. So we're under the 1,200 mark, all right, 1,100 and about 39 or so. So that's down. We're no longer number one in terms of murders. We're now number 7. I don't think that is, personally, that's not even a good place to be. We shouldn't be on that list any at all. But crime remains a crisis. Do you think that we're just throwing more money at the problem without looking at the real solutions?
Yeah. I do think that the long-term solutions to crime is linked to creating the kinds of opportunities for all of us to be able to lift our standard of
What
living.
might those be?
Well, there are lots of constraints. I mean, look at land. Access to land, we were talking about that earlier. Most people have no access to land, to resources on which they can, for example, assets that they can use to invest in a business. Most Jamaicans don't.
So I think I remember having a conversation with Dr. Diana Thorburn from Capri, and her statement pretty much ran in the same direction. They don't have tenure, so because you don't have tenure, then you can't make certain decisions.
About 25% of our population living in squatting communities and are squatting. Those are the international data I've seen, something like that. No, that's a problem if we don't have. No, we can go to housing, the quality of our housing. I mean, you've seen the pictures. Jamaicans see them all the time all over social media. I describe it as inhumane that people are living in, you know, when rain fall, the whole of them place flood out. I mean, come on, it's unacceptable. Right now, we boast that, you know, unemployment is at its lowest, but everybody, including the Prime Minister, has recognized that underemployment is a problem. And the wage rate is a problem. People are not able to have a decent, a livable wage. So these are issues that I suggest that we have to tackle. And we have to look again at the governance arrangement and the extent to which, if we shift it away from what we've inherited. Let me go back to where we've been. Because
Can we hold it to that thought until after the break?
Yeah, because I want to talk a little about what we got in 1963 and what we've done with it.
All right. Continue to stay with us. You're watching The Conversation, where I am sat with Professor Rosalea Hamilton, the founding director of the Institute of Law and Economics. Continue to stay with us. Welcome back to The Conversation, where we're pretty much looking at what keeps us, or what should keep us up at night as a country. You wanted to say a number of things before we went to the break, so now is your opportunity.
Yeah, I kind of wanted us to just reflect on where we're coming from, you know. Prior to 1962, in our independence, we had a structure of government that was essentially a colonial framework in which power was concentrated at the top of the society. And therefore, the organs of that structure of government suited the old colonial arrangement. Since 1962, we've really not changed and looked carefully at that arrangement up to now. We did something with respect to the Bill of Rights, and we had a charter, Chapter 3. We did some changes there. And if you think about a constitution, there are really two fundamental things it does. It seeks to protect these rights, define the rights, and so on, but it also defines the structure of government, the structure of governance, the people who we want to represent us, what powers they have, and so on. And now, we haven't really changed that fundamentally. And right now, what is on the table is that we need to move the king as head of state. That really should have been done from 62. Because what it would have clarified for the Jamaican people is that we run things, the country is in our hands, and that we now need to put different arrangements that are not similar to the colonial arrangement
but
in place.
Would that be significantly different though? Let's say that we don't have the king as head of state and we have a president, and then we still have a prime minister. How much different would that be?
That's exactly the point. It is not going to look any different. And it will only look different if we shift the structure. What would that mean? There are a couple of things it means. We have a lot of power concentrated in the hands of the Prime Minister in cabinet. There's no adequate oversight. There's no oversight mechanism. Think about it. Do we have parliamentarians saying, and it would of course be the majority on the governing side, right? Because that's where you'll get the final decisions. Saying to any Prime Minister, no, you can't get your way. You can't do that because guess what? Our constituency and the people we represent are saying that's not good enough, right? So we don't have that. So there's no real checks and balances with respect to the decisions that are made by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. That needs to change. But we need important oversight on those ministries of government. Last point there. All of a sudden, Jamaicans woke up thanks to the work of JAMP, who added up information that was very much in front of our eyes in the Auditor General's report and so on, right? That it's $3 trillion that are not properly reported and accounted for over the past 11 years. Now, if there was adequate oversight of those ministries, right, we wouldn't get there.
But I'm looking at what you're saying, and I'm wondering though. Let's say that we had that system that you're talking about. Wouldn't we always be possibly at a stalemate where we can't really make a decision? I'm just trying to...
Well, here's the thing about it. I mean, there are many societies. You can look at Europe, you know, Sweden, Switzerland, those kinds of countries, and others, where
they seem to be the exceptions.
Well, you know, they do, but if you look at the data, you see they sit on top of the world with respect to that GDP per capita, for example. The standard of living is way up. Does it have anything to do with the extent to which they've effectively decentralized the society and the decisions are not all concentrated at the top, but that places across the society, groups of people can make decisions about what's best for them? That's one way to think about it, right? Now, obviously, every society have their differences. One could look at a China, for example, and say, oh, well, everything stops at the top. But a careful look at this Chinese society will suggest that there are decisions that are broken down in these communities and so on. Remember one city or one small town in China is 6 million people, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a big society, you do break it up. And it is broken up. In America, it is broken up. The states have real power, right? So I think we have to ask ourselves, would we be better served if the people in rural St. Thomas and St. Catherine
had real power,
had power to make the decisions that affect that is in their interest? They know their land, they know their people, they know the assets they have, etc. And they also know their rich history that they could translate into commercial goods and services. But
what do we do first, though? Do we start to educate them first, or do we give them the system and say, figure this out?
Well, again, it's both, because this is why I say that this year, the real opportunity we have is to deepen this engagement around our Constitution. I credit the government for putting constitutional reform on the table. And I credit them with wanting a comprehensive and meaningful conversation and reform process that takes us to another level. But now what they've done is another story. But at least the intent, as is documented, is correct and sound.
Because my question now, based on what you have said, you know, do you believe that they have done enough to foster that kind of communication and to bring that argument so that we can all coalesce around this thing?
Absolutely. We've missed an opportunity, but the opportunity is not dead. We can do it in 2025 and beyond to really engage a serious conversation across the country, in every community, in every parish. So, I mean, the one-off town hall meetings and so on, so I know they tried. I think there was clearly a budgetary constraint, because I can't imagine that what happened, anyone could agree, was enough. There was no engagement, to the best of my knowledge, with the MPs and the councillors. I've been to communities where councillors say, boy, come talk because we want to hear about this thing too, right? And this is not on the JLCP or PMP side. Both councillors, mayors have said they have not properly been engaged in this process. So I think that there's a missed opportunity. We still have time, and the engagement is important. And the question, it's part of the engagement that I certainly have been involved in, is to really say to Jamaicans, what is it that you want? What kind of development do you want to see? And what arrangements is required to achieve it? And that's how, in the conversations I have had, it became very clear to me that there are serious deficiencies in the current local government arrangement that is giving life to the constitutional reform that was done, the constitutional amendment that was done in 2015 that put the local government arrangements in place.
So you have touched a little bit on the economics of it. We have looked at the crime. We have looked to some extent on unemployment, just minor. But we hear about education, and there's the issue of climate. Are there any silent crises that we're ignoring?
Many.
Wow.
Many. Climate, you mentioned, is one. That's real. Beryl is just the latest reminder. And the kinds of adjustments we have to make. And I want to come back to the point I'm making. It was in the throes of Beryl that I understood that this matter of decentralizing power and putting power in the hands of people is a life or death issue. Because if you can't prepare, you don't have the resources to prepare, you don't have the capacity to get access to the resources you need to prepare for a hurricane and to put the kinds of things in place that could protect you, your life is at risk. And I don't think, if you think about it, it absolutely doesn't make sense to me that the real levers of power in the context of a crisis is in Kingston. Right?
Yeah.
Where most of the ministries are, right? And although we've done stuff in some of the parishes and so on, the real resources are there. Look at what came out of Beryl. We saw it live. So a bridge is broken down, no communication now, with one side or the other, because, people cannot physically move. The local government said, no, we don't have any capital budget. The ministry said, well, that's a local issue. And then everybody's looking at each other. The people are suffering. No, my view is, if these decisions are in the hands of people, they understand the vulnerability of that bridge. Every day they walk on it. They know it.
Yeah, but we're seeing rationality now, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, they also can find those resources. There's no Jamaican that I know that doesn't have links to the diaspora and to people who can help them and are willing to help. And therefore, I think a different arrangement will enable us to use all the resources, intellectual, financial, all kinds of resources that we need to address our problems. And I think that issue of climate change is a huge one, and I think we have to think again about that structure of governance.
So if you were to draft 2025, well, Jamaica's 2025 survival playbook, as we ease into the break, what are the top 3 chapters that you'd put in there?
Well, I think the first one is how we shift and change the constitutional arrangement we now have to give the kinds of legal framework to empower our people. We begin to practice what that looks like even before we do it, because we know we have to go through a referendum. But I would begin to put arrangements in place that we can, get our representatives, both at the local and national level, to begin to engage us and to find different ways of shaping the outcomes that they ultimately want, hopefully aligned with what we want, because sometimes you see a dissonance, right? But if we can get those kinds of decisions and we collaborate in a different way than we've done in the past, I think we can begin that path, that process to how we get it. I hear your concern, and there are genuine concerns. There are no magic bullets, and there's no panacea anywhere you go. Putting power in the hands of people who don't understand what that means is a recipe for disaster. However, we are learning beings. None of us are fixed in stone. And
Yeah.
every politician I know went through a learning process. They didn't get there with the brilliance that they have or none that they have today, right? What they've done is have gone through a learning process. And I think most of us, if you're not sick, are capable of learning. And so I think if we go through that learning process and we set up institutional arrangements to facilitate the kinds of translation of the will of the people to policy and ultimately law, we can do it. We have tertiary institutions we've set up. We have graduates like yourself, come from communities all over Jamaica. Why not? If you can get a decent standard of living, go back to your community and uplift the standard of living of the people. Most of us would be happy to do that.
All right. So thank you very much. Those are 2 points that we just got. We can perhaps talk about the third one when we come back. Just want to remind you that you're watching The Conversation. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to The Conversation. We asked the question, election 2025, a crossroads or just another cycle? So we have spoken about a number of things, and what we really want to find out is what's underlying in the next general election. Will this be a defining moment for Jamaica, or can we say it's just another round of political musical chair?
Well, let me put it this way. If all of us, if we want to think about ourselves as the chairs and the politicians moving around us, if all of us stay still,
yes,
continue to simply watch the politicians move around, then it will become another musical chair.
When you say stay still, yeah,
meaning that if the majority of the Jamaican people, because I know all of us won't become active in this process, but if all of us really, if enough of us sit back and don't bother to vote and don't engage the political process. And by that I mean who actively engage in your representative, holding them accountable for the things that they do, pushing them to make decisions that represent your will, and ultimately being active in what we call a democracy, where it is supposed to be your will that our representatives carry. Now, if we don't get that point and we continue as we've done, I think, for most of our 60 years, where for some of us who bother to vote, we simply vote and then we fold our hand and wait for them to deliver. You say you're going to deliver, deliver. Right? That's our attitude, right?
Yeah.
You said this is in your manifesto, right? And there's not a active engagement for those of us who define ourselves as JLP or PMP or whatever political party. We sit back and just wait. Even from the inside of these parties, we're not critical. And I want to make a point that way, because for those of us who are proud of our parties, I think we have to recognize that none of these parties, none of them, nowhere in the world, are flawless. And when you see the first flaw, you should be the one saying, no, that's not what this is about.
So you're telling us that I need to pick the beam, or the beam out of my eye before I talk about the speck there?
Absolutely. I say that to every Jamaican, that if you don't want a democracy, let's continue to do what we do. Let's continue to do what we do and allow those in power to take power and do what they want with no and very little constraints.
So then no.
Let me explain that a little more and just remind Jamaicans. Notice what happens when we make a lot of noise. Right? When we block road or we go on social media, tell me if you don't see an adjustment. It may not be exactly what you want.
But there's something.
But there's a response. So politicians, to the best of my understanding, can't function unless they're supported by the people. The story of revolutions across the world is when the people get vexed and literally decide to kick them out. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just saying, and we don't have to get there. I don't think we have to get there if we continue to push, because we still have, I think, a fairly good tradition of both political parties listening to Jamaicans. Now, I would say it's not enough because the mechanisms are not there. They'll respond. I mean, I like to use the example of the festival song, right? We're getting to 60 years old, no festival song, and the Jamaicans carried on over it.
Yeah.
And then we got one, right? Just as simple as that. There are many other instances we could talk to. But here's what we need. We need organized mechanisms to make our voices heard. It cannot be that we're on social media, we block road, I am part of the Advocates Network, we do a lot of advocacy and so on. But that's not the way we run a country on a day-to-day basis. There are countries like the US and other countries all over the world where there are parliamentary hearings. And you can petition your parliament on issues that you want. And there are rules and regulations as to how you submit, when you have a voice. And importantly, those opportunities are opportunities to inform our policymakers about information they may not have. Now, let's think about it a little carefully. Policymakers, ministers, the executive is informed by a civil servant, a civil service and civil servants that have very aggregate data about the country. Yeah. That's what you go and you study and you look at trends and you do surveys and so on. They don't have, rarely do they have, specific information about what is going on in a particular community in any place.
Well, the communities should have that.
Absolutely. So the opportunities for them to come to Parliament or to go to the parish councils and say, hey, this is the situation. And my community, all of us, we've discussed it. And we feel that the best way to deal with this problem is this. There are no opportunities to do that.
So then no. Is there any real contest of ideas, or can we argue then that we're just recycling old promises?
Absolutely, absolutely. And let me say, for those who I'm sure are going to be critical for some of the things I've said, I have seen and heard, and I have been involved myself in writing, whether it is a member of parliament or the municipality, for years, and nothing happens. Jamaicans listening to me know, because they've been through that process. Nothing happens. Why? Because there's no rule, there's no law that requires them to even hear, let alone listen and act. And remember, I'm not suggesting that our representatives should simply be robots and we just tell them what to do and they do nothing. That's why we vote them in, to help us to make the judgments about what's best. But it can't be dominated, the decision cannot be dominated by their views without opportunities to hear us on a regular basis.
So a lot is now riding on the shoulders of our youth, all right? So we're talking about youth voter turnout and whatnot. Do you think that 2025 will be the year that young Jamaicans take or shake the system, or do you think that we'll sleep through it?
That's a good one. Let me say this. Every now and then I hear and engage young Jamaicans. I'm encouraged. I mean, most recently I saw a young Jamaican. Her hair was natural. And I said, how come you're here, your hair natural? Why you not, kind of? And she says, boy, I love my hair. And I was so taken aback to hear a young woman say, I love my hair. And therefore, I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just wearing it natural. So I say that to say the views are changing. We still live in a society where, quite frankly, some of us don't know what to do with the hair because we're not trained and socialized. But some of us just have a view that there's something else that looks better than our natural hair. And we continue to police hair in schools, right? And that continues to be a sore point. How is it that in 2025 that still exists? Where did it come from? It came from a school system in which our hair was not seen as the right kind of hair to be in a school system.
But I argue that structure is important, and you need to have structure because you're churning out adults.
What kind of structure? Whose structure? To achieve what? What does your hair have to do with your capacity to learn? For us to compete in the modern world today, unless we are creating, innovative, able to produce goods and services that compete in a global market, we will continue along this treadmill.
So how you look is not important?
How you look is not important. If you want to look, whatever, relative to achieving the kinds of stuff in your head, that's what is more important, not what is on top of your head.
All right.
So we define how we look in different ways.
So as we go into our final break now, if you could ask one ruthlessly honest question at national debate, what would that question be?
You mean about what is going on in the country?
Yes, in a national debate.
I would actually ask the Jamaican people, why is it that we're allowing what we see that is unacceptable to continue? Why are we not doing more? That's what I'd ask.
Why aren't we doing more?
Why aren't we doing more, all of us?
All right, that's food for thought. When we come back, though, we will be looking at, are we stuck? Are we ready to leap? Just want to remind you that you're watching The Conversation and we are going into our final break. Continue to stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Conversation. Just before we went to the break, you had a question to ask, why aren't we doing more? But then when we moved from that now, we want to look at governance versus politics. Can we finally grow up? So can we go beyond who wins and look at how we are governed? Do you think we can get to that place?
And that's why I asked that question. And it's a question that gets to the core of who we are in a democracy. We have to see ourselves as owners of Jamaica. Jamaica belongs to all of us. And just like you own anything, your cell phone, your car, you actively take care of that thing that you own. You don't just leave it to others to do as they want. So we ask representatives to manage our country on our behalf. We can't just sit back and allow the management to just go along and chips with teeth and say we can't bother or what have you. So that's why I start here. Why are we not doing more to understand our role in a democracy and the importance of our actions in shaping the national outcomes that we want?
So is it a case whereby governance in Jamaica is broken, or are we too distracted by politics so that we can notice it?
Well, I think that the approach to the political experience we've had has been much too divisive. It's one or the other. And I think most Jamaicans will look back over the 62 years we've had independence and said, yeah, there are strengths and weaknesses on both sides of the political fence. If we look good, we'll see it if we're honest. And so I understand from surveys I've done and polls that I've seen that many Jamaicans think it's a waste of time to vote because it's half a dozen of one, six of one, half a dozen of the other. We say it, right? But I want to say to Jamaicans that the active process of making a decision is important in an election because it says if you like what is happening, you're voting to endorse and support that. And if you don't, you're voting to change. And the change, I mean, yes, we're locked into two major political parties, but there are other parties that are evolving, right?
We might argue that they have not put themselves out enough. Fair
enough. But I also say to Jamaicans, if all of a sudden the outcome in the elections is that we have a 80% voter turnout, 20% of the votes go to parties other than the two political parties, that's a huge political story.
So then are we electing leaders?
But I want to finish that. The point is not simply voting, right? That we must go beyond vote. Voting, in a way, is a fairly passive act,
We need to demand leadership.
Yeah, we can go into the voting booth and say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and pick, right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, if you're not thoughtful about what you're doing, it's one act at one moment in a historic period in which significant changes can take place. So the real story of our active engagement in a democracy is the story about how we hold whoever it is that represents us, whether we voted them in power or not. They are our representatives. How we hold them accountable. How we say to them on a regular basis, what you're doing is not good enough. And I want to say to Jamaicans who expect that civil society organizations will do all the advocacy. You are part of civil society. You know, every one of us who are not government employees,
We're a part of it.
Right? You're part of civil society. And therefore, it's about writing. It's not about protest all the time. You have that right.
Well, we can define protest a number of ways.
Exactly. But it also is about writing to your MP, asking for a meeting with your MP. Come and talk to us. You know, we want to engage in the constitutional reform process. Say to your MP, listen, why have we not been engaged in this process? And so on and so on. Push, even if the outcome is predictable. At least you've done your part, and the more we do these things, the more that action will get noticed.
So tell me about the future now. We want to find out if we are stuck or we are ready to take that leap. And why I asked that question, though, I asked that in the context that if we fast forward to 2035, you know, and all the problems that we have now are still there, whose fault will it be?
Well, I take the view that we have to take collective responsibility for the outcomes of our society, if we see ourselves as owners. If we don't, then we can blame somebody else, right? Because it's your thing, that is your country, it's you mash it up. Having said that, I also understand that the power lies in other people's hands, these representatives that we've put in place, right? And therefore, we have to take the power we have, and we have power, which is in our numbers, in our capacity to collaborate and work collectively to make our voice heard, even if there are no mechanisms for that voice to be heard. Let's demand those mechanisms. Let's use whatever mechanisms we have because they exist. And I want to remind us that we still have a democracy where freedom of speech matters. Some may argue that it's eroding, but I am able to speak, you're able to speak. We still have a fairly free press, and we're still able to make our voices heard. It is an asset that we must protect, because we've seen in countries where it flitters away, it can be eroded, that decisions can be made to take that right and that asset away from us. So we have to protect it. So I want to suggest that we need to do our part, and part of that work is to hold the people we put in power responsible. Hold the people who our tax dollars are now paying tripling of salary or whatever it is, right? Significant amount of money. Some of us are of the view that some people don't deserve it, because we're seeing and we were promised that we would get better outcomes if people were paid better. But
Well,
we're seeing
that
very
just
little.
happened, right?
Sorry?
That just happened.
What just happened?
The whole remuneration and all
Absolutely, but it's more than a year now, right? And we ought to be seeing that these things should deliver better outcomes. Now, my point is that if you see better, great. Go ahead, go into the elections and vote. Reinforce the government of your choice.
Yeah.
And if you don't, actively express that, whether through the ballot or through your ongoing engagement in the society. And that is so important for us to create this republic that we want. You know, everybody, I listen to the conversation on a regular basis, and there's really a kind of mindset that, you know, what is the government doing? But that's not what we want. I'm saying, like, what is it that you want? How are you making your voice heard? How are you saying to the government, listen, this is not quite what we want?
So we're not articulating enough.
And let me also add that it really is unacceptable for the government to put a bill in place and tell the public that you have, I think it was the 19th of January, that you have until the 29th of January.
10 days.
Come on. that you can't be serious, right? And remember, it was tabled from December. So even if the instruction was the 27th of January from December, that would have been better. Some of us would have used our holiday. I know many wouldn't, but some of us, I did use my holiday, and I looked very closely at that bill, right? So the point is that we have to be serious about engagement, and we have to say to our government, that time frame is just not enough. We want to have a say, we want more time, and we want to understand this process better so that our voice can be heard.
How can we future-proof Jamaica?
What exactly does that mean?
So we can start from, because we started with economics, what would be our next big economic opportunity? Are we already too late to seize that, do you think?
I love these buzzwords, future-proof. Listen, the future is what we create. It is the actors that shape history, not passive people who sit back. Think about it. So there's no foolproof future. There's no guarantee. No. Absolutely. We shape the future. And the future we need to shape is a world in which Jamaicans, Caribbean people, we're part of a region, are able to create the kinds of goods and services that we have control over, meaning we drive the technologies. We are the innovators and the creators. So we can set those prices globally because these are things that we generate. Right now, we are price takers for much goods and services in the world. These very phones that we all depend on, we're not creating these. So the technologies are such now, as we get into AI and robotics and all these kinds of things, we're in there already, we can do some creating and shaping those outcomes. And the more we do that, the more we create the kinds of incomes that can ultimately live the standard of living, address some of the economic challenges we have, like the debt, etc., and ultimately create a world in which not only our standards of living can rise, but a world that we can feel safe in, because we can protect ourselves against countries that, treat us with the disrespect that we're seeing in the world. Yeah. And ultimately, we have a society and a country and a world that we can feel proud of. So
I'm still hearing about education, because we started to look at that. And education is supposed to be the great equalizer, but my question now is, why isn't it? Sometimes I don't think that it is. That's why. So that's my bias coming out.
And I think for me, a lot of it is that we've perpetuated too much for too long. Yes, there have been changes in the education system, but it's clearly not enough when we look at the outcomes. It is still true to say that the majority of our students leaving the public school system is not prepared for the world of work. They've not achieved the required, whether you define it as 5C-Sec, including maths and English, or whether it is, your TVET type programs or whatever that definition is. Most of our kids have not achieved it. Now that is the single biggest indictment on the education system. Yeah. In spite of all the great efforts, we've seen studies after studies after studies, and the outcomes are the same. And I suggest that we live in a world now where learning can take place in a different way and is taking place in a different way. All of us are learning every day on our cell phones. Now, we have to be able to discern whether it is fake things that we're learning versus. But when you net out, there's a lot of good information there and capacity to check. So if we do our checks, fact checks and so on, and do research, this is something it doesn't sound kind of right. Well, go check it out. Absolutely. And the process of doing that, we are learning. And I suggest, therefore, that we have to think differently about the school system. We have to think differently about, again, a very centralized approach to the education system. I think we have to put much more power in the hands of the teachers and the schools to make decisions with the guidance, because we understand that we want to be able to attain
national outcomes.
Absolutely. But you have to allow, for example, kids who live in crime-prone communities and because of the violence are not able to go to school. They have to have flexible mechanisms to catch up.
Yeah.
If they don't catch up, the outcomes are predictable.
So
again, resources and power
has to be distributed
at the local level, because even if the school doesn't have the power, the community has, and the community will be able to say, hey, I know that we have to work with these kids over the weekend. We will find the food, we will find the transport, we'll find whatever it is, because we want to make sure that these kids get their education.
But that's going to be difficult because some of these communities aren't as regulated as we'd want. Because remember, you know, we started out by saying that there's not enough tenure.
Is the problem regulation, or is the problem an arrangement that can facilitate sustainable and growing economic and social outcomes?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, because if the government doesn't have a foothold in that community, there's no representation of the government in those communities. But I can't even get certain things in there. How do we put that infrastructure in place?
But I don't think that Jamaicans are interested in not having a relationship with the government, no matter how you restructure government. Government has power. Government has resources. Most of our tax dollars is going to government, central or local, right? So I'm just saying, it's how we shape a different relationship
with the government,
between the government and the people in communities that will matter.
All right, so as we go now, what's that one call to action that you'll give Jamaicans if they really want to change our country's trajectory?
I think I would say to Jamaicans, understand your role in a democracy. Understand how central it is for you to make your voice heard on matters that touch and concern your life. And especially as we look at the climate change issues that confront us, when we see how vulnerable many of us are, I think these kinds of experience ought to remind us that we're not powerless, we have agency, and that we need to harness the kinds of opportunity that can exist when we work together to protect ourselves and ultimately create a framework that can enable us to live better, live good, and achieve the outcomes that we want.
Oh, Professor Rosalea Hamilton, thank you very much for sitting here and having this conversation with me. So, numbers tell one story, but lived reality tells another. As Jamaica enters a crucial election season, how do we ensure governance isn't just about winning power, but using it well? The conversation doesn't stop here. Stay engaged, stay informed. I'm Kwame Thomas, and on behalf of the entire CTV production team, thank you for watching and see you next time.